It's a local edition. I'm Jason Dole, and we're joined by David Lombardo from the Capitol Pressroom to break down the June 24th primary results. A big focus today is the unexpected turn in New York City's mayoral race. And we want to talk about what that shakeup means for statewide politics potentially, and also how might it impact Albany dynamics, the Albany upstate, downstate dynamics between Albany and New York City. And of course, next year there's a gubernatorial race. So, what does this mean for the road to the 2026 governor's race? We'll also explore what results say about voter turnout, shifting Democratic coalitions, and the role of younger voters, especially with names like Antonio Delgado entering the mix. So, thank you so much, Dave, for being here to help break us all down.
My pleasure.
So let's start, like we said, with New York City. Was this a surprising outcome, and why do you think it happened?
I think the result is definitely a surprise. I don't think people envisioned that after the first round of ranked choice voting, and for listeners, this is a system that exists in New York City for primary elections and is not available elsewhere in New York. But I think there was an expectation that Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, would be leading in the first round of ranked choice voting, where ultimately you need to have a 51% of support to get elected. A simple plurality won't do it for you. And there was an expectation that Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani, his challenger to the far left, who was considered the number two contender, might be able to make up any sort of first round deficit in future rounds of voting. But what we saw was that Mamdani, after the first round of voting, was the leader. He had a plurality of support. And I think that was a big surprise because it spoke to both his popularity, but also the strength of this anti-Cuomo movement that has been present since he resigned in 2021 as governor and gained steam once he came back into the spotlight with this mayoral campaign. And the anti-Cuomo forces really coalesced as a behind a couple different options, but primarily with this focus on beating Andrew Cuomo. So I don't think I'm necessarily that surprised that Zohran Mamdani is going to be the Democratic nominee in New York City, but I am surprised by the scope and magnitude of his victory.
Beyond the personal aspect of the candidates and their history and their baggage in some cases, what does this result say about what Democratic voters are looking for, at least in New York City?
Well, I think you make a important point there because Andrew Cuomo comes to this race with a lot of baggage. It's not just him, but it's his dad. I mean, they've both been now running for mayor of New York City for half a century, both being denied. And I think this can't necessarily be seen as a repudiation of him. It can't necessarily be seen as a repudiation of more centrist democratic politics or an embrace of, say, democratic socialist ideas. I think there are a lot of ingredients to this victory for Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani. And most important, I think, for him was the way he was able to turn his messaging into a populist message that wasn't necessarily identified as the democratic socialist message. It was something that resonated with people who might be more centrist, as well as those people who might be more to the left, because he talked about affordability in a way that I think resonated with a lot of people. So his message was something that was really important, but also the way he was delivering that message. He is a once in a generation communicator, both in terms of the way he talks and the way he packages his messaging. And I think that enabled him to catch fire in a way that someone else who might have the same viewpoints or might talk the same way in a one-on-one conversation could not. So I think those are some of the big elements, and I'm curious to see how the Democratic Party moves forward based on this, because there are some reductive ways of looking at this, which would be, oh, social media is important. Well, yeah, it is important, but you have to have a message and messenger that work on social media. Well, populism is important. Yeah, but you need to hit the right populist notes and not be uncomfortable talking about things like raising taxes. And so I think couple people are watching this election with real questions about what it means for their future. One of them being the Lieutenant Governor, Antonio Delgado, who's hoping that he can launch some sort of populist challenge to Kathy Hochul in 2026 for the gubernatorial nomination of the Democratic Party. I also think that incumbent Mayor Eric Adams is watching this to see whether he might have some pathway as a centrist running in New York City. Already, we heard from Long Island Congresswoman Laura Gillen, who has run kind of as a centrist Democrat, that she's thinks that Zohran Mamdani is a real problem and is disassociating with him. I'm curious to see how Kathy Hochul responds to this, because I think that'll set the direction for the state Democratic Party as a whole, because she is the de facto leader.
And just to stay with that for a moment, you mentioned Antonio Delgado and how he might be positioning himself for a run in light of what happened in New York City and
Mhm.
the results of this primary. And you're also saying, like, these results don't necessarily mean you can't be too reductive about what it means. You can't say too strongly, well, this means they're embracing more of a socialist agenda, things like that. But that doesn't mean that outside of New York City, people can't spin those implications various ways. So, beyond Delgado, what do you think these results in New York City might mean for the rest of New York state politics?
I think that it could be contained to a certain degree, because what we've seen over the last 6 years now is that socialist candidates have had success in New York City for the most part. There is an exception in the Catskills with Sarahana Shrestha, an assembly member who was successful in unseating a Democratic incumbent. But again, that also speaks to someone who ran against a very unpopular incumbent. She had a very populist message. So I think my takeaway would be, if I'm trying to replicate this success as a Democrat in upstate New York, whether it's in an assembly race, a Senate race, or a large municipality, I think the message has to be: one, stay true to yourself. Zohran Mamdani is good at this stuff, and he leaned into what he was good at. If you're not good at that, don't try to do it, because voters can suss out that type of insincerity. But also, that populist message is something that works. It's something that crosses party lines. Assemblymember Mamdani has talked about how he appeals to the Trump AOC voter, something that seems like an oxymoron, but it is something that exists. But like in the mayoral elections that we saw this past Tuesday outside of New York City, where there were Democratic primaries, whether it's Syracuse, Buffalo, Albany, there wasn't any sort of populist uprising. We saw candidates who were backed by the Working Families Party, the liberal third party in New York, be successful. But I think for the most part, they were very establishment aligned. And I think for the most part, the establishment has the infrastructure, they have the political support to be successful in the Democratic Party moving forward still.
Any other messages that you see coming out of these upstate primaries? It's a very local primary. This past one that we just had, it was very different, town by town, county by county. But what, if any, other messages can you pull from what happened upstate?
I was surprised by the amount of money that was spent in some of these races, particularly by outside forces. And I think that speaks to the new reality of how big money is part of not just congressional or presidential elections, and not just assembly and senate elections, but local elections. Obviously, in New York City, I think $25 million was brought in by outside groups to spend against Assembly Mamdani's campaign. But even in Albany, I think more than $1 million was raised by candidates and outside interests. And I think that speaks to how important these races are, and how people recognize that the outcomes are so significant. But I also think what we saw was that grassroots outreach is still very important, whether it's in New York City, where the Cuomo campaign was relying primarily on that media blitz on the TV and on social media that they were paying for. I think the people who were knocking on the most doors, the people who were making those contacts with voters, were ultimately the most successful, whether you were in New York City or in Albany and Syracuse.
You can't predict the future, but do you think that will be a truism moving forward over the course of the next couple of years?
I think that for races in the legislature, whether that's Congress or here in Albany at the Capitol, I think that knocking on doors can make a much bigger difference than, say, a TV ad blitz. If you're running a gubernatorial campaign, though, where you're in a state with 19 million people, it's just not practical, one, to build up the infrastructure of volunteers to knock on all those doors, or for you yourself to ring all those doorbells. So I think for that gubernatorial campaign, I think it's really important that you have money to spend on that ad blitz. And that's something that Kathy Hochul has no problem doing as governor. She's been a prolific fundraiser. And it's really one of the things that I'm watching for with Antonio Delgado and trying to assess the sincerity of his campaign. Because in July, we'll get a campaign finance filing from him. And if he's been able to bring in two, three, even $4 million at this point, then I take him much more seriously than if he's only got a few $100,000 in the bank heading into a year-long campaign where he's definitely going to need in excess of $10 million to run a serious challenge.
We're talking just a day after the primary, so I don't know what, if any, demographic information is connected to the results from yesterday's primary. We did talk about the role of more progressive candidates or progressive voters. What about younger voters? Is there any sign of what they were doing yesterday?
Yes, in New York City, young people made up a disproportionate share of the electorate. And even in a Democratic primary, you would expect that young people make up a larger share of the vote than, say, the general electorate. But they turned out in ways that has always been promised and are maybe threatened by young people. But yeah, that 18 to, I think, 48 demographic voted in real significant numbers in New York City. And I think that can be a major source of the victory for Zohran Mamdani. It's a movement that was energized. He himself is 33, so I think he speaks their language to a certain degree, but he's also talking about issues they care about, and whether anyone else can mobilize those young people in the same way remains to be seen, because we haven't really seen this type of turnout before by young people. And again, Mamdani as a candidate is kind of a unicorn.
And here's yet another thing in this conversation that now I'm wondering, like, to what extent might that translate past New York City? Will we see that trend continue? I imagine New York Democrats and Democrats around the country would be curious to see if there would be more excitement among young people after this primary.
Yeah, but it's all contingent on how the party sets itself up, and it's contingent on the candidates that they back. It's contingent on the issues that they push, because Zohran Mamdani was not the establishment choice. In fact, I have to imagine the state Democratic Party chair, Jay Jacobs, doesn't know what to do with himself right now when his former ally, Andrew Cuomo, someone who speaks the language that he knows, is out. And maybe he needs to reckon with where the party is heading, or at least where it needs to be heading, if it wants to grab on to these voters who can make a real big difference in some of these swing districts where they're often taken for granted as someone who won't turn out.
Last thing before we go, looking ahead, what do you think we should be watching in Albany as we get closer to this 2026 election cycle?
I think the thing to watch is how the Governor Kathy Hochul, positions herself for the 2026 legislative session. Is she going to take this mayoral victory by Zohran Mamdani, where he got more votes than she got in New York City in the 2022 gubernatorial primary, as a message that she needs to moderate her politics? Will she take it as a reinforcement of what she already believes and the fact that she needs to pivot more to the center? So there are these moving parts that she's going to be responding to that I'm very curious to see, because she has this gubernatorial primary coming up now just 12 months away.
All right. Well, we've been talking to David Lombardo from the Capitol Press Room. Thank you so much for being here with us to break down the primary.